Hi, folks. So this is going to be a short lecture on the fiction unit, the Introduction to Fiction section. So you'll find these slides under the fiction tab on your Brightspace page. So you can read along with me if you want, but I'm going to be showing them on the screen, so you don't have to do that. I do recommend taking notes though, so that you can refer back to this when you are working on your fiction essay. And we're going to go over that in the video as well. So the first slide here mentions that fiction is a type of literature. So this is a literature-based class, and fiction is one of the types of literature that we're exploring in this unit. And fiction, you might have heard of fiction versus nonfiction. So fiction is a type of literature that describes imaginary characters. So characters and events that do not really exist in the real world. These are some examples like fairy tales, fables, all the novels that you might have read in high school, any fantasy literature. This also qualifies mystery or science fiction. Think about like Star Wars and Star Trek, historical fiction. Lord of the Rings is a fantasy novel series. So anything that is a novel or a fantasy setting, anything that's not set in the real world is considered fiction. And even if it's set in a realistic type world, but still maintains imaginary characters, it's still considered fiction. So, for example, The Great Gatsby is set in a world kind of like ours. There are human characters and everyone's kind of very normal. It's still the 20s, but it is a fictional tale. Some genres of fiction include crime, fantasy, romance. We've got sci-fi, horror, and then they can be broken up into age groups. So we have young adult fiction, and then new adult fiction, which is where you would probably fall into. Then there's coming of age novels or coming of age fiction, and then realistic fiction, which is mostly what we're going to be reading in this unit. And realistic fiction is fiction that represents real world characters and settings. So settings that mimic the world that we live in. And here on the right are some examples, some things you might have read in high school or heard about before. Lord of the Flies, The Catcher in the Rye, Heart of Darkness, The Great Gatsby. Those are some examples of some fictional novels or stories. So when you are reading fiction, and these rules also apply to the rest of the semester for drama and poetry as well, some good general guidelines is to read the fiction or literature more than once and read for the total experience of the work. So don't just read for the entertainment or for the content, but read for the experience of the piece itself. Reading slowly for keeping an eye on what words are chosen, what feelings and emotions are expressed, and what ideas come across. And make sure to underline any key words, phrases, or passages. It's also a good idea to underline or highlight, or, if you are reading online, you can either highlight in the PDF or highlight online the words that you might not be able to immediately define, and then go define them. And I think it's a good idea to take notes on your personal responses or ideas that might occur to you as you're reading. And these can be anything like your personal reaction to something that occurred in the text, or your own questions about the text. Another good example of interaction with the text would be to read aloud, especially dialogue or sections that are meant to be read aloud, like poetry and drama is really meant to be read out loud. And then be open to new possibilities or new ways of thinking. Don't reject a way of thinking just because you can't understand it on your first reading. In fact, a lot of the things that we'll be interacting with this semester might be hard to understand on the first reading. So don't toss it out the window just because it might be a little hard to understand. Give it a second chance, give it a second read through. A lot of the content that we'll be reading this semester is short, so you'll be able to give it a second read through. And on the right side of this slide are some questions you can ask about the work. So what's the basic story or plot? This is a great way to test yourself on your own knowledge of the story. Some good examples of questions like these can be the quiz questions that I ask you in each unit. So who are the characters? What characters are speaking, or who are they addressing? What character relationships exist? What's the context or situation of the scenes? What action might be taking place? And is there any conflict? And finally, do you see any themes or ideas which might be implied rather than being explicitly stated? Most of the time when we are reading literature, the themes are going to be implied through the text and through the actions of the characters rather than being explicitly outright stated, right? If we're reading a text about race, for example, the Alice Walker piece we read in this unit definitely deals with race, but I don't think they mention race at all. I don't think they mention Blackness at all, or race relations really at all in the story. We are just meant to understand that that is a theme of the story, and so that is an implicit understanding of that theme. So keep that in mind as you're reading. Here are some vocab words for this unit. These might be things you might be familiar with from before, but it's a good refresher. Theme, which is a universal idea, lesson, or message explored through the work of literature. The plot, obviously the events that took place in the story. The character, so a person, animal, being, or creature in the story. These are the people who obviously are speaking the dialogue, or the creatures who are speaking the dialogue. And then those characters might have relationships. Some literary devices are mentioned here, like metaphor, simile, and imagery. A lot of those things we'll get into later in the poetry unit. Foreshadowing, again, is mentioned. A lot of these literary devices we'll get more into in the poetry unit. But point of view is something we've talked about in the discussion board posts, and narration, who is narrating. The narrator is the person whose perspective we are hearing in the story. And then conflict. And those literary devices are continued on the next slide. Like I said, these we will continue to talk about through the poetry unit, so don't abandon these slides entirely as we move forward. Metaphor, imagery, simile, all these literary devices we will carry over into the poetry unit. And not all of these you will need to be able to define, obviously, for your essays. But if you are going to identify, for example, a metaphor in your fiction essay, then you need to know the definition of that term. So make sure that you're familiar enough with these that if you identify them in the fiction that you are analyzing in your fiction essays, that you do that accurately. So here are the definitions of those terms. And like I said, don't abandon these. We will come back to them when we hit the poetry unit. One thing we talked about a lot in the discussion board post was point of view. There are technically 4 different types of point of view that we have discussed, but it's broken up into 3 perspectives, right? So we've got a first person perspective. A first person point of view is when the reader accesses the story through one person. So it's like reading the main character's diary. You will notice pronouns like I, me, we, or us used in first person writing. So for example, the Alice Walker short story, Mama was our narrator, and it was through the first person perspective. This limits the scope of what a reader can know about the other characters, but it's the truest to how we live our lives, since often it is the case that we experience our own worlds through a first person perspective, right? Through our own first person point of view. There is the third person point of view, and that is broken up into 2 categories, third person omniscient and third person limited. But typically the third person narrator can know everything. So you will see pronouns referring to characters like he and him, she and her, they and them, it and its, in the third person point of view. This point of view allows for the greatest flexibility when it comes to narration, and it also creates the most complexity. This is often the case when you are telling a story with lots of different characters where you need to include lots of different scenes with lots of characters. The narrator is obviously able to speak more freely. So in third person omniscient, omniscient means godlike almost, where we have a narrator almost looking down like an eagle eye view. The narrator speaks freely about everyone and everything. So all characters are able to be seen and their perspectives are able to be seen through. There are no limits to the time, space, or character the narrator can access. Whereas a third person limited perspective only gives the narrator the thoughts, feelings, and actions. They're limited to one central character. So even though we are using, third person pronouns like he or she when referring to the main character, we are still limited to that main character and their actions. A good example of this is the Harry Potter series. Even though the reader has access to scenes that happen across time and space, we, as the reader, are only ever given scenes from the perspective of Harry Potter or kind of over his shoulder almost. But we still refer to Harry as he, right? Harry is still referred to as he. He goes into the classroom, things like that. So instead of I, he would be a first person narrator if it was using I. But here they refer to Harry as he, so it's a third person limited perspective. The very, very infrequent use of a second person perspective sometimes comes into play when the narrator uses you pronouns, so referring to the reader almost. We'll see that come up a lot more in the poetry unit, and so I'll bring that up again later. We don't have any fiction texts in this unit that use second person perspective, so I didn't put it in the slides here, but it technically is a type of point of view that you might come across in your literary analysis, but we don't have any literature in this unit that uses second person perspective. The most important thing I wanted you to take away from these slides is this last slide about active reading and annotating. And this again will apply to all of the units. So the fiction unit primarily, but when we get into the poetry unit and then the drama unit, it will also apply there. So it says, when reading fiction for fun, you might not catch all the literary devices, point of view, or plot points. However, when you are reading fiction in an academic context, you must learn how to read actively. Reading actively allows us to think about the things that are happening in the literature and how to interpret and analyze the meaning of the piece. The link below outlines how to read actively and when reading actively is important. Please follow the link and read how you can participate in active reading when you are reading text for this class. And this link will take you to the Open University. It's a free online university link about active reading, and it's really brief. It does not take long to read, but you really should read it because it tells you how to read for comprehension, how to skim through the text quickly before you read deeply, so you can kind of look for important parts of the text. And then it actually tells you how to take notes on the text as well. So you can click through these skills on how to active read and how to take notes on the text. And that will really help you kind of engage with your text a little bit more deeply, because when we get to the fiction assignment, which I'm gonna go over in a second, it's gonna be really important for you to dig a little bit more deeply into your interpretation of the text. And you're not going to be able to do that if you haven't, read the text really closely. The rest of the slides in this slide set are context for the readings. Even if you have already done the readings, it's really important that you get the context for those readings. So please make sure that you go over these slides. The first slide introduces the author. So for example, this slide introduces Kate Chopin and the information about her and her history, her most popular work. And then, so for example, here's a slide about Flannery O'Connor, and then some of them have slides about the text itself. So for example, A Good Man is Hard to Find has its own slide about some main themes. The Ambrose Bierce story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, has its own slide about the themes and the plot structure, because that story has its own plot structure issues, right? It has flashback in its plot structure, so it is a non-chronological story, and so that is a part of the discussion when we talk about the plot structure of an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge that doesn't apply to the other stories that we've read. So please make sure that you read over these slides very closely. I'm not going to go over them in the lecture because these are your responsibility, but they are a required part of the online content. So when you are signing up for an online class, you're signing up for an online lecture as well. And so the lecture video, I'm trying to make as short as possible so that you don't have to listen to me lecture for an hour, but you signing up for an online class also makes you sign up for these slides as well. So know that you reading these slides is like reading the lecture notes. But I've tried to make them as easy to understand and as easy to get through as possible and as quick to get through as possible so that they can be most useful for you and provide as much context as possible for you without, burdening you with a ton of work. So if you have questions about those slides, please let me know. At the very end, there is a slide about the differences between symbol and motif. One of the questions on the assignment that we'll go over in a minute discusses the most important symbol or motif in one of the stories. So make sure that you know the difference between a symbol and a motif so that you can use those words correctly in your fiction essay. And that's the last slide in the slide set. So make sure that you read back over these and are clear on that. And I'm about to go over the fiction essay and then I'll be done. Okay. And for the fiction assignment instructions, I have included the instructions as a file here, but the instructions are also in the assignment itself under course tools. So for this assignment, it says you will choose one of the 4 options. There are 4 prompts listed. Consider the questions for each option below, formulate a response, express your conclusion in a clear thesis statement, systematically explain why you think this thesis is true with clear topic sentences, offer examples and quotes that support your topic sentences. Those are required. A quote from the text is required to support every claim that you make. And no unnecessary summary. Each piece of evidence needs to be explained with a sentence or 2 so the readers can see it as you do. No outside sources or AI will be allowed or tolerated. Be sure to choose a question that you can respond to at length. The final paper should be at least 650 words. That's where we're starting. That's not too bad. And here are the 4 prompts. The first one, in your opinion, what is the most important theme, symbol, or motif in one of the texts we have read? It's fine to come to a different conclusion than we did in class discussion. In a thoughtful essay, identify what theme you see as the most important in the text and explain, using examples from the text, why you believe this to be the central theme. Number 2, what point of view does one text use? How does this point of view affect the story? Does the point of view shift at any point? How does the point of view or points of view help communicate the theme or themes? Number 3, how is the plot organized in the story you selected? Is it chronological or non-chronological? Does the author use foreshadowing or flashbacks? How does the plot organization affect the story? And how does the plot help the story communicate its central theme or themes? And number 4, compare and contrast how the same theme is used in 2 of the texts. For this prompt, you should use at least 1 paragraph in your paper per text to discuss the use of the theme in each story. So 1 paragraph discussing it in one text, then 1 paragraph discussing it in the second text, then the rest of your paper, so the 3rd and 4th or whatever, how many body paragraphs you need, can make a point about how those themes are similar or different. So the comparison needs to be there. And then here I say, do not feel like you must answer all of the questions in your essay. Use the questions as a starting point to begin your analysis. And below that, I have paper guidelines, the ways that I will grade the paper. So, the expectations for the MLA citations, things like that. No works cited pages required, but I am expecting MLA format for the essay. So if you have any questions about the essay assignment, please let me know. I'd be happy to answer those for you. But remember, this is a really fast turnaround on this essay and all essays. So just do your best. I recommend getting all of the content read and getting all of the fiction unit stuff done so that you can start working on this. Okay. If you have any questions, please let me know and I'd be happy to answer them, and I'll talk to you soon.